Welcome everyone to this Privacy Roots Privacy Espresso. Today I'm joined by Padraig Walsh from the law firm Tanner De Witt in Hong Kong, because we're going to speak about a case coming from Hong Kong related to a data breach. Padraig is an expert in privacy and data protection and deals with data breaches because it's part of his work and his profession. So Padraig, we can just warm up with a brief introduction on what happened in that case.
So in this case, it related to a data breach that occurred to the local Hong Kong subsidiary of an international company headquartered in Japan. A hacker gained access to a redundant email account, as in an employee had left the business. And the hacker just kind of sat there and watched what happened for about 4 months, observed the traffic, and then at a particular point in time when a payment request was being made, stepped in masquerading as the authentic owner of the email account and asking for a diversion of the payment to a suspicious account. This was notified, and then there was an immediate investigation which identified the intrusion, and the company in question closed down the accounts and took various steps. But at that stage, there had already been a data breach that affected over 1,000 customers. So a relatively significant data breach. I think what's interesting, by virtue of the notification to our regulator in Hong Kong, it led to an investigation that then led to an investigation report which was published. This is the kind of thing that gives us an insight into what is happening in terms of what the information security setup of that kind of a business is, and the attitude that the regulator takes within that environment. So the actual incident itself is a fairly typical kind of incident. But what I took from it was that there are so many things that people can learn from in terms of basic things they can correct in their information security systems and protocols that can at least make it a bit more difficult for hackers to intrude. And these are some of the things that came out in the Privacy Commissioner's findings.
This is, first of all, very interesting. And in this regard, I'd like to know more about which were the findings of the Privacy Commissioner there and what this will lead in the future possibly.
So what happened here is that the Privacy Commissioner went through a fairly typical investigation process. So they required the company in question to commission an expert consultancy report to look into what went wrong and make recommendations as to what should be improved going forward. And then based on that, they made findings, and those findings then led to what's called an enforcement notice, where the Privacy Commissioner says, these are things you must do and you must attend to. And one of the things that the Privacy Commissioner said in respect of the company in question was that they did the decent thing first in respect of making the data breach notification. Now, why I say that is that unusually in Hong Kong, it's a recommended best practice, but it's not an unlawful act to not notify the Privacy Commissioner or the data subjects in question. They notified reasonably quickly also. And then the way that the company responded to the inquiries made by the Privacy Commissioner was all, good corporate responsibility in terms of how they responded. All that being said, some of the findings in relation to what went wrong are easy pickings that can be fixed quite easily. Let me give you some examples. In respect of consultants found a number of email accounts of people who had left the business. If a hacker gains access to an email account that is not in regular traffic in respect of the email systems, then the hacker would be able to start sending emails without other people in the organization being alerted to that activity and to that conduct. So it's a major security issue or security flaw if you don't have a process or protocol where a person leaves the organization, close down the email account within a very short time. Password management. There were a number of email accounts that were still using the default password set up by the email service provider. Another example, there wasn't two-factor authentication. So these are rather simple things that could be done better. And what struck me was how common this must be across business and industry generally, where you're at a size where you're big enough to be a target, but not necessarily big enough to have the resources to have a dedicated focus in respect of cybersecurity and information security issues. So there's a lot that people can pick up from this in terms of things you can do that can have a much bigger impact than necessarily the size and cost of accomplishing those small things.
That's really a great point, Padraig. It's extremely relevant for anyone working in this environment, I think. As you were rightly saying, that sometimes little security steps can really make the difference in the future and maybe avoid much bigger loss. And I didn't hear about fines. So under that point of view, maybe you can delve a bit more on why there was not a fine, or maybe in the future there could be a fine.
Just to answer your question directly, the reason the Privacy Commissioner didn't fine was because the Privacy Commissioner presently doesn't have the statutory power to fine in these circumstances. What would happen is if the company in question did not comply with the enforcement notice, that would be a criminal offense, but the case would be referred to the Department of Justice and they would run the prosecution. And that's perceived as being a gap in the enforcement powers and authority of the Privacy Commissioner. And this is one of a series of proposals that has been advanced in respect of the advancement and development of privacy law in Hong Kong. But if something like this should happen to someone, say, a year from now, the position may be quite different.
Hopefully, companies will get more and more prepared to avoid this situation in the future, given new regulation coming. And just one last quick question, which is the lesson learned from this case?
Well, I think that, and we've touched on some of them already, but the idea that there is, to use a cliche, low-hanging fruit that you can actually address in your organization, which need not necessarily have a significant financial budgetary impact. These opportunities exist for, particularly for medium-sized organizations. There are some easy fixes that businesses can do and can achieve. The other thing that I would say is that something that you mentioned earlier, Alessandro, which is the reaction of a business that may not necessarily have done things fully right. But when an incident happens, the culture kicks in and they respond appropriately. And then that becomes an inflection point in respect of how they approach this particular risk and this issue. And it can be a wake-up call when a data breach happens. If that happens, you need to be able to tap into an organization, a law firm, a range of consultancy support that helps you to respond to the data breach in a way that matches and aligns with your corporate culture. So you do your best to implement the best practices in that scenario that you would hope to aspire and adhere to. And then in respect of managing the data breach, from that point forward, you're now on a new path, which is a path of training, culture, developing systems, processes, procedures, looking at that in respect of people who are coming into the organization, looking at that from a technical perspective, looking at that from a legal compliance perspective, and making sure that you have the right support in those various quarters is also something that is again becoming more and more important. So knowing that there's, you could say, a crisis response when an emergency happens, once that is managed and you've gone through that kind of inflection point where you know what your future is, having the right resources and support to be able to maintain the rights, develop the right systems, maintain them, train people, inculcate that culture within the business. An organization like Privacy Rules, for instance, can help people in those moments.
Padraig, thanks a lot for touching this point, because we are pointing on a sort of crusade of privacy rules, in particular under the prevention activities, because we don't think that necessarily prevention is that expensive. We can also support medium enterprise and companies or smaller companies in taking smaller steps that can avoid to having bigger losses. And again, the point that you were touching, also having different perspective with different kind of expertise can really make it easier to work and provide better services. That's basically what we are doing. So thanks a lot for underlining these, and thanks a lot for your time and for your very quick explanation of this case and its implication in particular. Thanks for being with us, and thanks to all our listeners for following us today. I look forward to meet you all in the next Privacy Espresso.